Hello everyone, and we welcome you to another video. In this video, we will reveal the true and real story of Thanksgiving and how it is tied to the Bible, God's Word. So as you gather together for Thanksgiving this week, with your friends and family to participate in a feast Americans have celebrated for hundreds of years, you may have questions about the true origin of Thanksgiving. There's so many stories and variations all over the internet pertaining to this, so we give this information, but we highly encourage for you to do your own research and stick to what you want to believe. And we hope you find the right answers, as we did, as we are just like you. We did our research, and this is what we found. Now there is good side and the bad side to say about all of this, except during this time in history in the 1600s. We do not really know, as some of you did not know, except by research on this topic, and you will come up with all kinds of people's take on this, in their versions of the truth, of what really happened, as some of you were not physically there. Just as we were not either. The history of Thanksgiving has been muddled, debunked, and rewritten throughout history, and told to cover up certain events that happened to bring this holiday into what it is now. But now you're going to find out the real truth that no one is telling you, and probably never thought to. And we say it is a pagan day because it is not found nowhere in the Bible. Oh, they link it to the Leviticus feasts in chapter 23, and they pull out certain scriptures to back up this claim, just like they do everything else, except the false, the real truth, and they use as a once-a-year tradition to bring thanks to God in heaven. Notice they only thank God in heaven once a year, and not each and every day. This just shows where some Americans' hearts are really at. Now here's real truth of why Americans carve a turkey and mash some potatoes each year, and how it all started. Every fourth Thursday of November, Americans gather around tables covered with turkey, potatoes, cranberries, stuffing, and more. Over the feast, they share as what they're most thankful for from the previous year. Some also celebrate the day by watching the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade or a football game, or even by running a 5K race. But that's not how Thanksgiving has always been celebrated. The holiday and the traditions behind it have evolved from a much mythologized 1621 harvest feast shared by the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag to a post-Civil War era patriotic and religious gathering, to the modern holiday focused on good food and spending time with family. Historians long considered the first Thanksgiving to have taken place in 1621, when the Mayflower Pilgrims who founded the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts sat down for a 3-day meal with the Wampanoag. However, the meal wasn't the meaningful symbol of peace that it was later portrayed to be. Rather, it was likely just a routine English harvest celebration. Early illustrations of the first Thanksgiving show a friendly meal between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag in 1621, but that rosy depiction masks a violent history. Within years, the colonists launched a war on their neighboring tribes and ultimately massacred them. In 1841, Boston publisher Alexander Young printed a book containing a letter by Pilgrim Edward Winslow, which described the feast. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might after a more special manner rejoice together. There were many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest their greatest king Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. Winslow didn't describe the feast as a Thanksgiving, which at the time was considered a period of prayerful fasting, but when Young published the letter, he dubbed the meal the first Thanksgiving in a footnote, and the name stuck. In November 1621, the Wampanoag heard the Pilgrims shooting off guns, which historians believe worried the Wampanoag that war was underway. King Massasoit sent 90 men to investigate before realizing the Pilgrims were in mid-celebration. The Wampanoag then hunted deer meat and joined the festivities. The newfound peace between the Pilgrims and Wampanoag was driven largely by tribe and trade rivalries, according to Ann McCullen, curator at the National Museum of the American Indian, who says that the Wampanoag realized an alliance with the Pilgrims could fortify their strength. Now here is the part they will not tell you. There were 2 different groups from England. First you had the Pilgrims, and then you had the Puritans, and it is easy to get them mixed up just by looking at them. As they come from the same country, their attire looks the same. For example, you know both salt and sugar are both white. Both are the same if you looking on the surface, but there is a big differences between them. The same if a person was looking at the Pilgrims or the Puritans. Now, both of these groups of people are from England and wore the same kind of clothes that they wore back then. And people looking at these pictures could not tell which one is which. And this is the point. People are blaming the wrong people. And we're guessing maybe the Indians could not either, as all of the are white men and look the same. If you ask the kids of today the difference between Puritans and the Pilgrims, chances are that they would draw a blank. But when you ask the same question to someone a bit older and having some interest in religion, they would interpret these two groups as people belonging to the same Catholic Church. There are many who would rather harp on the similarities between Puritans and Pilgrims. However, it is a fact that there are differences between Puritans and Pilgrims that will be highlighted in this video. So let us see what big differences these two groups, Puritans and Pilgrims, exhibited. Whether Puritans or Pilgrims, both groups branched out from the same biblical Christianity. The story begins in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, when people who felt dissatisfied with the Church of England were referred to as Puritans and Pilgrims and Separatists, which the Pilgrims separatists and the Puritans were non-separatists. Within this wide group of people, there were people having a very distinct set of beliefs. Most of the Puritans remained within the confines of the church and decided to cleanse or purify the church through Second Reformation, as they felt the church was coming under too much of Catholic influences. However, some Puritans defied the Church of England and dared to make their own churches, which was enough for the church to persecute, harass, and victimize such people. It is ironic that the people who themselves faced persecution and had to flee to another continent persecuted their own people for challenging the Puritan authority. The Puritans seemed to be into religion too deeply that they went off track, thinking that this is the type of religion that God was asking them to follow. Then I ask you, which God? Satan, as stated in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 4, says, in whom the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them. 'Cause the Puritans sure did not believe in the 10 Commandments. Sounds like they were doing what the Romans and the so-called religious leaders, Pharisees and Sadducees, were doing in the time Jesus Christ was on the earth and before he came. There were arrests, sentences, and even murders of these breakaway pilgrims. Fearing for their lives, about 100 men, women, and children set sail for Holland, where they felt dissatisfied with the corruption of their faith and identity. The reasons the Pilgrims chose to leave Holland for the New World, as the negative effects of the culture of the Netherlands, and seems like there was something else going on during the 12 years they was there. It had a bad effects on the Pilgrims' children, the same way some parents feel today about your children. And we will cover this in more detail in the next video. From there, the Pilgrims, known as Separatists, went to move to a smaller supply boat called the Speedwell, Delfshaven in Rotterdam, and it would meet up with the Mayflower ship. But along the way, the Speedwell seemed to have a lot of problems for some reason. It could have been rigged to delay the Pilgrims in getting towards America, where they named the settlement as Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth Rock, after they left England and Holland behind them. Who are Pilgrims? Pilgrims were separatists, the first people to set foot to the New World from England after declaring their dissatisfaction to the way England church worked. They were essentially separatists. These Pilgrims, who came on Mayflower, could not survive the harsh winters of the new area, and by the time spring arrived, nearly half of them perished. However, despite all hardships, the group survived and even prospered a little bit. The group was bolstered by more Pilgrims coming and joining them. Pilgrims were few in number, with only 102 men and women. Some Pilgrims came for religious purposes, while some came looking for better economic conditions. Pilgrims want themselves to be separated from the Church of England. They would also aim at separating themselves from the so-called non-believers. Pilgrims were the breakaway faction of the Church of England that left for new pastures and finally settled in America at a new place in Provincetown, Massachusetts, near Cape Cod, that they named Plymouth in remembrance of the land they left, Plymouth, UK. In a religious sense, Pilgrims were different from Puritans, as they did not believe in bowing down to the supremacy of the Anglican Church and wanted to save their religious thoughts and freedoms. Pilgrims were traders and rather poor. Pilgrims wanted to have more control over their religious lives as well as to save themselves from persecution in England. Now the Puritans, on the other hand, are a group of extremists in Protestantism. Though they were not satisfied with the reforms of the church, they still did not leave the church and stayed with it, advising reforms. Puritans came to America by the thousands. Puritans mainly came for the purpose of spreading the religion in the New World. Puritans were rigid followers of Protestantism, who were dissatisfied with the Church of England and many of its practices. Some of these Puritans stayed back and decided to purge the system from within, while some of them went to the New World, without severing ties with the Church of England, to spread their religion in the New World. A Puritan thoroughly believes that religious schools have paved the way for the corruption in the worship of God. Therefore, they firmly believe that people should resort to pure forms of worshiping God and thus establish a personal connection with God. Puritans never aimed at separating themselves from the Church of England. Instead, Puritans attempted to change the English Church. In addition, they only want to purify the church of the influences of the Catholic Church. In short, it can be said that the Puritans are the English Protestants who strived hard to simplify the religion. They aimed at the simplification of religion, especially after Reformation. Thus, a Puritan is deeply rooted in the firm belief of returning back to the very beginning of Christianity. The Puritans were strictly Calvinists and followers of the reformer John Calvin. And Paul Washer and John MacArthur teach this very thing today. And you know John MacArthur is good friends with James Robinson's. Puritans, who came to the New World, belonged to the upper classes. Also, most of the Puritans who found their way to the New World were well educated. As you can see, though both Puritans and Pilgrims followed the same religion, they had different views as to how to proceed with their faith. So it is so easy to get them mixed up just by looking at one of them on the surface. And we're going to show you that the Puritans were the ones who killed the Indians and not the Pilgrims, as everyone claims. The Puritans believe in ethnic cleansing or genocide, and you're asking, what is this? And they will push this in America, and the Catholic Church is in behind it. As they push for one world religion, this what they do to persecuted Christians. If you do not convert or renounce Jesus Christ, and you see ISIS do this as well. So we telling you, do not give in to this. It is part of Satan's plan, and you will not see it coming until it is too late. The religious leaders did it to Jesus Christ and all the disciples, and they will do it to you as well. Now here you are. Now listen, and listen very good. The Puritans started all of this, as it was done back in the Romans' days. Now, if you have heard about the word Holocaust, you can very well understand the two concepts of ethnic cleansing and genocide. Though the word Holocaust, from the Greek holocaust, an animal burnt alive for sacrifice, was used for hundreds of years, it was reserved for the systematic and brutal annihilation of the Jewish population in Nazi Germany during the Second World War in Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler. More recently, killing of some 800,000 Tutsi people in Rwanda by Hutu tribe in 1994 is another glaring example of genocide, which is nothing but mass murder of a political or religious group by another group in a country. Ethnic cleansing is a very close concept which confuses lots of people. In this video, we will give you the differentiate between the two. Ethnic cleansing deals with the word cleansing. In ethnic cleansing says it all. It is a systematic attempt by one political or socio-religious group to remove a particular ethnic or religious group from a specific area through coercive and sometimes through killings means. And this what the Puritans did to the Indians. It includes both forced migrations as well as brutal killings to terrorize a minority population and force them to leave a particular territory. And this as well. The Puritans kill the Indians. Though the word ethnic cleansing has been used by historians while explaining the systematic and brutal killings of Jews in Germany and many other European countries at the behest of Adolf Hitler during World War II, the very fact that it involved mass murders to the tune of some 6 million Jews indicates that it was more of genocide than ethnic cleansing. This how the Puritans killed the Indians. In the ways and means utilized to achieve ethnic cleansing include torture, arbitrary arrest, execution, assault, rape, forcible eviction, loot and arson, destruction of property, and so on. The purpose is to terrify a particular ethnic group, to force them to leave a particular area to create a more homogeneous population. Though there has not been a single definition of genocide to satisfy all people, even the definition by UN fails in its attempt. The very inclusion of suffix "cide" in the word genocide is enough to refer to killings. It is similar to ethnic cleansing in the sense that a political or religious group decides to exterminate another political or ethnic group from the midst of their presence. Though the purpose of genocide is same as ethnic cleansing, the means adopted in genocide are much more brutal, as it involves mass murders and brutal killings. And you see this still happening in this day and age. With all the persecutions of Christians, and the abortions, and what they are doing to little children, going on all around the world, the contemporary persecution of Christians includes the genocide of Christians by the Islamic State, and persecution by other terrorist groups, with official state persecution mostly occurring in countries which are located in Africa and Asia because they have state religions or because their governments and societies practice religious favoritism. Such favoritism is frequently accompanied by religious discrimination and religious persecution, as is also the case in currently and formerly communist countries. All Christians have suffered this genocide. Now, just a year after the crucifixion of Jesus, Saint Stephen, who was considered an apostate by Jewish authorities, was stoned to death for his alleged transgression of the Jewish faith. Saul, who later converted and was renamed Paul, acquiesced, looking on and witnessing Stephen's death, and later, Paul begins a listing of his own sufferings after conversion in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1, and 3 times I was beaten with rods, and once I was stoned. Now Peter and other early Christians were also imprisoned, beaten, and harassed. Ancient Arabian Christianity has largely vanished from the region, and the main reason for is Prophet Muhammad's direct orders to eliminate Jews and Christians from Arabia. Sahih Muslim 1767. It has been narrated by Amr b al-Khatib that he heard the Messenger of Allah say, "I will expel the Jews and Christians from the Arabian Peninsula, and will not leave any but Muslim." And you know this was a lie, and they believe in a man-made teaching, and they do not claim Jesus Christ as the Son of God, and claim he was just a prophet. Jesus Christ is the truth and the life and the way. Jesus Christ is the only way to the Father in heaven, and they do not honor the 10 Commandments either. By 1637, the détente between the Puritans and Wampanoag had disintegrated, and the Puritans started a decades-long war with their indigenous neighbors. Ultimately, the colonists massacred the local tribes, including the Wampanoag. Now, people need to get this straight. It was not the Pilgrims, but the Puritans who massacred the Indians. Over the years, the word Thanksgiving has changed in meaning. Originally an English tradition, days of Thanksgiving typically were marked by religious services to give thanks to God, or to celebrate a bountiful harvest. The first recorded religious Thanksgiving Day in Plymouth took place a full 2 years after the 1621 feast. It celebrated the end of a 2-month drought. According to 1621, a new look at Thanksgiving. Later Thanksgivings celebrated military victories over Native Americans made by the Puritans. At the time, Thanksgiving days were usually declared by governors or priests. First founding father George Washington frequently declared days of Thanksgiving during his tenure as General of the Continental Army. Once he became president, Washington proclaimed the first National Day of Thanksgiving in 1789. But many subsequent presidents ignored the tradition until President Abraham Lincoln again established Thanksgiving as a national holiday during the Civil War. cementing the feast as an American tradition. That declaration marked the switch from random feast days, some marking the fall harvest, to a national holiday. Lincoln was partially convinced by Sarah Josepha Hale, editor of the magazine Godey's Lady Book, who wrote a letter campaigning for an annual Thanksgiving holiday. He was also looking for a way to gloss over the schism created by the Civil War and homogenize an American identity. But the holiday wasn't celebrated universally, particularly not in the southern states that saw it as a Yankee holiday. After the Civil War, however, the holiday became imbued with nostalgia for the mythological founding of America at Plymouth Rock. The true story of the Pilgrims and Native Americans was not widely recorded or even accessible, so stories of benevolent pilgrims conquering and founding the country were being passed off as history. Indeed, much 19th century artwork and reenactments of the first Thanksgiving depicted the Native Americans as savages with woven blankets and large feather headdresses based off tribes from other regions. They also changed the typical dress of pilgrims to depict their religious intensity and bravery. After Lincoln's proclamation, Thanksgiving typically took place on the last Thursday in November, but in 1939, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt tried to move it up a week in hopes of allowing more time for Christmas shopping and stimulate the post-Depression economy. It becomes tied to a commercial aspect, and we get Black Friday, Johnson says. That's when it gets divorced from the religious and civic reasons behind it. And the term Black Friday refers to this. The first recorded use of the term Black Friday was applied not to post-Thanksgiving holiday shopping, but to financial crisis, specifically the crash of the U.S. gold market on September 24, 1869. As the story goes, after an entire year of operating at a loss in the red, stores would supposedly earn a profit went into the black on the day after Thanksgiving, because holiday shoppers blew so much money on discounted merchandise. Back in the 1950s, police in the city of Philadelphia used the term to describe the chaos that ensued on the day after Thanksgiving, when hordes of suburban shoppers and tourists flooded into the city in advance of the big Army-Navy football game held on that Saturday every year. Not only were Philly cops not able to take the day off, but they had to work extra long shifts dealing with the additional crowds and traffic. Shoplifters also took advantage of the bedlam in stores and made off with merchandise, adding to the law enforcement headache. By 1961, Black Friday had caught on in Philadelphia, to the extent that the city's merchants and boosters tried unsuccessfully to change it to Big Friday in order to remove the negative connotations. The term didn't spread to the rest of the country until much later, however, and as recently as 1985, it wasn't in common use nationwide. Sometime in the late 1980s, however, retailers found a way to reinvent Black Friday and turn it into something that reflected positively, rather than negatively, on them and their customers. The result was the red to black concept of the holiday mentioned earlier, and the notion that the day after Thanksgiving marked the occasion when America's stores finally turned a profit. People gather at Alcatraz Island for the Indigenous Peoples Sunrise Ceremony, or Unthanksgiving Day, on November 28, 2019. The event commemorates the years of 1969 to 1971 occupation of Alcatraz by Native American activists protesting white settlers who stole their land. Native Americans and supporters have gathered at noon on Coles Hill in Plymouth to commemorate a national day of mourning on Thanksgiving Day since 1970. Participants in the National Day of Mourning honor. But for many Native Americans, the holiday invokes a legacy of racism, violence, genocide, and mistreatment. In the 1970s, right around the bicentennial of the U.S., Native people began to gather on the holiday to hold a day of mourning instead of a tradition known as on Thanksgiving Day. The 1621 harvest celebration had a menu of venison, corn, shellfish, cornmeal, beans, nuts, dried berries, pumpkin, and yes, turkey. Turkey is one of the Thanksgiving dishes that can easily be traced to the first Thanksgiving. According to the 5th edition of Holiday Symbols and Customs, the Pilgrims and Native Americans likely hunted and served wildfowl, like geese, duck, or turkey. The native large bird was relatively easy to capture, so it quickly became an important source of food for early American settlers. In the U.S., an estimated 46 million turkeys are killed each year for Thanksgiving alone. Thanksgiving is a time when people of America celebrate their freedoms, their liberties, their families, and the little things that bring people happiness. Many turkeys are slaughtered without being stunned at all. In the processing plant, turkeys are shackled by their legs and hung upside down. The turkeys' throats are slit on a circular blade before being placed in a scalding tank meant to loosen feathers, and sometimes they're just boiled alive in pain until they are dead. And it still happens today behind closed doors, all for the money to be made. The custom of snapping the turkey's wishbone, bringing luck to the person who gets the larger half, can be traced back to the Romans. It was certainly a well-established tradition in England by the time the Pilgrims brought it to America. But regardless of what graces your holiday table, it's important for Americans to educate themselves on the true history of the holiday, which has been distorted and reshaped through the years alongside cultural shifts. It's tough to reconcile with that history, because Thanksgiving has kind of an apocryphal mythology around it, as most Americans today no longer celebrate that myth of the first Thanksgiving anyway. They're just celebrating family. When you sit down at your dining room table this year with a plate filled to the brim, it's a great time to give thanks to God for all He has provided for you in your life. With food so readily available and at your fingertips, as people often forget the simple blessings taken for granted that are right before them. Now we thank you so much for watching this video, and we hope you learn the truth of what really happened, and the Puritans were the ones who done this pain and suffering to our Native American friends, who were the first one to discover America and were the first slaves. We thank our Native Americans friends for standing strong. Our prayers are with you and everyone, and may God bless each and every one of you and your family. ID our prayer.